A renowned chef drops dead mid-meal. Was it the dish or the dinner guest? Welcome to Marple Casebook. I am your host, Selwyn. I love hearing from fellow mystery fans. Share where you're watching from in the comments. Your words always bring warmth to this channel. Let's begin. The dinner service at the Red Pheasant had been flawless until the chef collapsed. Philippe Laurent, the acclaimed head chef, had just presented his signature dish, a saffron-infused seafood bisque, to a table of distinguished guests. Moments later, he staggered backward, clutching his throat, his face contorting in pain. The entire dining room froze. A gasp rippled through the guests as Philippe fell to the polished floor, his pristine white coat marred by a shattered bowl of bisque. Within minutes, the staff scrambled to help, but it was already too late. By the time the ambulance arrived, Philippe was dead. The police arrived soon after, led by Inspector Morton, a man known for his meticulous approach to investigations. The restaurant was immediately sealed off, and the guests were ushered into the waiting area. Among them sat a familiar figure, an elderly woman in a soft blue cardigan and a neatly pressed skirt. She was Miss Jane Marple, visiting from St. Mary Mead on a short holiday. She had come to the Red Pheasant upon the recommendation of her nephew, who had insisted it was the best dining experience in town. Now she found herself in the middle of something far more intriguing than a gourmet meal. The initial examination of the body revealed no signs of external injuries. There was no struggle, no apparent wound, and no indication of poison, at least none that could be detected at a glance. Philippe had simply collapsed, as if fate itself had plucked him from the world. But fate was seldom so direct, Miss Marple thought. Inspector Morton began questioning the restaurant staff. Sous-chef Anton, a wiry man with sharp eyes, was pale as he recounted the events. He was fine all evening. We were rushed, yes, but nothing unusual. Philippe was in good spirits until he wasn't. Miss Marple observed the man carefully, noting the slight tremor in his hands. Was it grief or something else? The kitchen staff swore that only Philippe had handled the final dish before it left the kitchen. The waitstaff confirmed that no one had tampered with it en route to the table. Yet the bowl of bisque he had tasted just before his death was now a ruin on the floor, its contents smeared across the tiles. "The autopsy will tell us more," Inspector Morton said, though his expression showed frustration. A man didn't simply drop dead for no reason. Miss Marple's gaze swept across the kitchen. Everything appeared in order, but one thing caught her eye: an empty tin of saffron lying in the bin. It had been opened recently. Saffron was an expensive and potent spice, but it was not lethal. Still, something about it nagged at her. "Excuse me," she said, stepping closer. "May I ask when this saffron was last used?" Anton looked startled, but answered, "Just before service. Philippe insisted on using only the best, so we opened a fresh tin." Miss Marple bent slightly, peering at the label. A frown creased her face. "This isn't the brand used by most high-end kitchens, is it?" Anton hesitated. "No. Philippe had it shipped from Spain directly." Miss Marple straightened, her mind spinning. There was something there, something just out of reach. But before she could voice her thoughts, a commotion erupted in the dining room. One of the guests, a man in an expensive suit, was insisting he needed to leave. "I'm a very busy man," he huffed, his eyes darting nervously. "Surely you don't need me here any longer." Inspector Morton stepped forward. "And you are—" The man sighed. "Gordon Whittaker. I own several restaurants in the city, including this one." "Ah," Miss Marple said softly, watching his reaction closely. A restaurant owner at a dinner service should not look so uneasy. Morton asked sharply, "Were you close with Philippe Laurent?" Whittaker hesitated a fraction too long. "We had disagreements, creative differences. But I wouldn't poison him," Morton finished. Whitaker stiffened. "Is that what you think happened?" Morton ignored the question. "We'll need a full list of everyone who had access to the kitchen today." As Whitaker exhaled sharply, Miss Marple glanced once more at the discarded tin. A rare imported saffron, a poisoned meal that seemingly poisoned no one else, and a restaurant owner who looked rather like a man who had just realized something had gone terribly wrong. The pieces were there. Now she just had to fit them together. Miss Marple's fingers hovered briefly over the discarded saffron tin before she straightened, smoothing the fabric of her cardigan as she turned back toward the dining room. Inspector Morton was still questioning Gordon Whitaker, who had regained a semblance of composure, though his fingers twitched slightly as he adjusted the cuffs of his suit. "I assume the saffron was sourced through proper channels?" Miss Marple asked lightly, her voice mild but her eyes sharp. Whitaker glanced at her, then at Morton, as if debating whether he truly needed to respond to a little old lady. "Of course, Philippe had a preference for direct imports. He insisted on it." Miss Marple nodded as though satisfied, but in truth her thoughts were elsewhere. The saffron, it was the only thing unique to the dish Philippe had tasted before his sudden death. And yet saffron wasn't a poison. It could, in extreme doses, cause illness, but not death. Still, something about it nagged at her. As the conversation continued, Miss Marple let her gaze drift across the room, observing what the police had not. The guests were restless, shifting in their seats, some whispering in hushed voices. The staff, though visibly shaken, seemed preoccupied with the presence of the authorities rather than grief. And then there was Anton. The sous chef had withdrawn into the background, arms crossed, eyes darting now and then toward the kitchen. He looked anxious, but not in the way one would expect of a man mourning his mentor. He was nervous, not about the death itself, about something else. Miss Marple adjusted her handbag and took a step closer, her small frame unassuming. "You were quite fond of Philippe, weren't you?" she asked gently. Anton started at her voice. "Oh, of course," he stammered. "He was a perfectionist, wasn't he?" She continued, her tone conversational. "Some might even say difficult to work with." Anton exhaled sharply, his fingers tightening over his arms. "He had high standards." "Ah, yes. High standards can be rather taxing on those around them, and yet you stayed." Anton hesitated, then said, "I stayed because this was my chance, to work under someone like him, to learn." "And did you?" Anton opened his mouth, then hesitated. "Yes," he said finally, but the way his gaze shifted away suggested there was more he wanted to say. Before Miss Marple could press further, Inspector Morton reappeared, a folder in hand. "The preliminary toxicology report just came in." He flipped it open. "No trace of any common poisons in his system. No cyanide, arsenic, or strychnine. Nothing." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "I expected as much." Morton frowned. "Then what killed him?" Miss Marple tapped a finger against her chin. "The answer, Inspector, is always in the details. There is something here. Something that seems ordinary, but is entirely out of place." Morton sighed, glancing at the crime scene again. "I don't suppose you'd care to elaborate." She smiled. "Oh, I intend to. But first, I'd like to have another look at the kitchen, and I should like to see where the saffron was kept." Morton nodded and led the way, though he muttered under his breath about the peculiar habits of elderly detectives. Back in the kitchen, the staff had been instructed to remain in the adjoining break room. The stainless steel surfaces gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and the scent of spices still lingered in the air. Miss Marple moved slowly, taking in everything with a quiet intensity. She paused near the spice rack, her fingers tracing the labels. Then she knelt down and opened the bin where the discarded saffron tin had been tossed. She took it out again, examining the label more closely. "This is an unusual brand," she murmured. "You said it was imported." Anton, who had been watching from the doorway, nodded. "Yes, it arrived just this week. Philippe was excited to try it. Who handled the order? Anton blinked. Philippe, of course. And did he open it himself? Anton hesitated. Yes, I think so. Miss Marple gave him a knowing smile. You think so, or you know so? Anton swallowed. I don't remember exactly. Morton narrowed his eyes. Are you saying someone else could have tampered with it? Anton's lips pressed into a thin line. I don't know. Maybe. Miss Marple held up the tin. There's one way to find out. Inspector, would you be so kind as to have this tested? Not for poisons, but for impurities. Morton sighed but nodded, passing it to one of the officers. I'll have the lab check. Miss Marple turned back to Anton. One last thing, dear. Did Philippe seem surprised by the taste of his own dish tonight? Anton's brows furrowed. Now that you mention it. Yes. He hesitated, just for a second. I thought it was nothing, but Miss Marple smiled. No reaction is ever nothing. You see, dear, taste is a powerful thing. It can tell us more than we realize. Morton frowned. And what exactly do you think it told him? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. That he had just eaten something he never intended to. Inspector Morton wasted no time assembling the key witnesses in the restaurant's dimly lit lounge, where a few untouched drinks still rested on polished tables. The soft murmur of voices had faded as the reality of the situation settled over the room. Philippe Laurent was dead, and someone in this very building had played a part in it. Miss Marple, seated comfortably near the fire, watched as Morton conducted his inquiries with the practiced patience of a man who had seen more than his fair share of liars. She listened too, not just to what was said, but to how it was said, tone, hesitation, the flicker of an eye or the twitch of a hand. People always revealed more than they meant to. The first to be questioned was Gordon Whittaker, the restaurant's owner, who leaned back in his chair with the easy confidence of a man used to exerting control. But his fingers drummed an uneven rhythm against the armrest, betraying an underlying tension. I've told you everything I know, he said, exhaling sharply. Philippe was a difficult man, but he was brilliant. We had our disagreements, but you don't throw away a chef like him over creative differences. Miss Marple, who had heard many versions of such a sentiment in her time, smiled pleasantly. It must have been quite a challenge, working with someone so particular. A restaurant is, after all, a delicate balance of power, isn't it? Whittaker's gaze flickered toward her, assessing. Yes, but I managed. Managed? He hesitated just a beat too long before saying, Philippe was demanding. He didn't like interference. If he wanted a dish a certain way, it was his way or nothing. Morton tapped his pen against his notebook. Were you at odds over anything specific recently? Whittaker's mouth tightened. He had threatened to leave, said he was done with the red pheasant. I told him we'd discuss it after tonight's service, but his jaw clenched. Well, we won't be having that conversation now, will we? Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. And was he planning to open a new restaurant? Whittaker turned toward her sharply, then forced a neutral expression. I heard rumors, but he hadn't told me anything outright. Yet you were worried enough to insist on being here tonight. He gave a dry chuckle. I own the place. I drop in often. But tonight was different, Miss Marple said softly. Tonight Philippe was preparing his final service, wasn't he? Whittaker didn't answer. Morton sighed. We'll come back to you. He gestured for Anton, the sous chef, to step forward. Anton looked uneasy as he perched on the edge of his seat, hands clasped tightly. I already told you everything. The kitchen was busy, but nothing unusual happened. Miss Marple gave him a gentle smile. But you see, dear, it's often the smallest things that turn out to be the most important. Tell me, when did Philippe taste the bisque? Anton blinked. Just before service. He always did a final tasting. And did you see his reaction? Anton hesitated, then nodded. He looked surprised, just for a second, but he didn't say anything. Not a word. Anton shook his head. No, he just sent the dish out. Morton frowned. And you're sure no one else handled that bowl before it reached him? Positive. He plated it himself. Miss Marple studied him for a long moment. And did you prepare the saffron for him? Anton's jaw tightened. No, he did that himself. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. Curious, isn't it? Anton swallowed. What is? She smiled. That a chef as meticulous as Philippe, a man who never allowed anyone else to interfere with his final touches, should have reacted with surprise to the taste of his own dish. Anton's throat bobbed, but he said nothing. Morton turned to one of the waitresses, a young woman named Elise who had been responsible for serving Philippe's final dish. She twisted the hem of her apron in her hands. I swear, I just brought the bowl out like always, she said. I set it down, stepped back, and then it happened. Morton studied her. Did you notice anything unusual before then? Elise bit her lip. Not exactly. But when I went to pick up the bisque from the pass, Anton was already there. He was standing near the counter where Chef had left it. Morton's gaze sharpened. Anton, is that true? Anton's head snapped up. Yes, but I wasn't touching anything. I was just... He stopped himself. Just what? Just checking the plating, Anton said quickly, making sure it was perfect before it went out. Morton exhaled sharply. You're not the head chef, Anton. That wasn't your job. Anton's shoulders hunched slightly. Force of habit. Miss Marple watched him with a kind but knowing expression. Or perhaps guilt, dear. Anton looked away. Morton turned back to Elise. Did you actually see him touch the dish? Elise hesitated, then shook her head. No, but he was close. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Elise, you said you served the bisque just as always. But tell me, when Philippe tasted it, did he take a large spoonful? Elise frowned. No, just a small taste. Barely more than a sip. Miss Marple sighed softly. And yet, that was all it took. Morton folded his arms. What are you thinking, Miss Marple? She gave him a gentle smile. Oh, I have a few thoughts, Inspector. But we mustn't be hasty. You see, what we have here is not just a crime of opportunity. This was planned, and yet the execution was imperfect. Whitaker shifted in his seat. Meaning? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Meaning that someone in this room knows exactly what happened to Philippe Laurent, and they're trying very hard not to let it show. Miss Marple's fingers traced the delicate embroidery on her handkerchief as she observed the room. The threads of deception were unraveling, but they had not yet revealed the full picture. A murder was never committed in isolation. It was built upon layers of emotion, history, and intent. And tonight, the motives were thick in the air, as pungent as the saffron-laced bisque that had sealed Philippe Laurent's fate. Inspector Morton rubbed his chin, glancing between Anton, Whitaker, and Elise. We're missing something. A clear reason. You don't just kill a man in the middle of service without a motive. Miss Marple smiled gently. Ah, but Inspector, we have an abundance of motives. The difficulty lies in determining which one was strong enough to turn intention into action. Whitaker's fingers drummed against the armrest again. I don't appreciate the insinuation that we all had reason to harm Philippe. Miss Marple looked at him mildly. Oh, but you did, Mr. Whitaker. A man as influential as Philippe, he made waves, did he not? And waves have a way of unsettling those around them. Morton nodded. Let's lay it out properly, then. We know Philippe was planning to leave. That puts you, Whitaker, in a difficult position. A Michelin-starred chef walking away from your restaurant? That could ruin you. Whitaker's mouth twisted. I would have found another chef. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Ah, but not another Philippe. And certainly not one who could carry the same prestige. Losing him would have meant more than just replacing a name on the menu. It would have meant the end of the red pheasant's reign. Whitaker exhaled sharply but said nothing. Miss Marple turned her gaze to Anton. "And you, dear, you stood to gain something as well, didn't you? If Philippe left, who would naturally take his place?" Anton stiffened. That's ridiculous." Morton scoffed. "Not so ridiculous. You'd be the next in line, wouldn't you? The promotion of a lifetime." Anton's jaw tightened. "I didn't kill him." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "No one has said that you did. But you were close to the bisque. You had an opportunity. The question is, did you have the will?" Anton swallowed hard, but again said nothing. Miss Marple turned next to Elise. The young woman flinched slightly under her gaze. "And you, dear, you were the last to see Philippe alive." Elise's hands trembled slightly as she folded them in her lap. "I just served the dish, that's all." Morton narrowed his eyes. "That's all? You were nervous before. You hesitated when you spoke about Anton standing near the dish. Are you sure you didn't see something else? Something you're afraid to say?" Elise opened her mouth, then closed it. She looked at Anton, then at Whitaker, then back down at her lap. I don't know." Miss Marple studied her carefully. Fear. That was what lay beneath Elise's hesitation. Not guilt, but fear. She exhaled softly. "You're afraid of saying the wrong thing, aren't you, dear? Afraid that by speaking you might place yourself in danger." Elise's lower lip trembled, but she nodded ever so slightly. Morton's grip on his pen tightened. "Danger from whom?" Elise hesitated for a long moment, then whispered, "I don't know." Miss Marple tapped a thoughtful finger against her handbag. "Then let us consider another angle, shall we? Not who might have killed Philippe, but rather who wanted him dead the most." Morton huffed. "That doesn't exactly narrow things down." Miss Marple smiled. But it does, Inspector. You see, murder is never simply about opportunity. It is about urgency. Who needed him gone tonight? Who could not afford to wait?" The room fell silent. Whitaker, despite his financial troubles, could have survived Philippe's departure. He would have suffered, but he could have found a way forward. Anton, while eager for a promotion, had no real reason to act so soon. If Philippe left of his own accord, he would have inherited the kitchen naturally. But there was something else, something lingering just beneath the surface. Miss Marple turned her attention back to the saffron. "Tell me, Inspector, have we received the results from the lab yet?" Morton checked his watch. "Should be any moment now." Almost on cue, an officer entered the lounge and handed him a printed report. Morton's eyes scanned the page, his brow furrowing. "Well, that's interesting." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. I suspect we are about to confirm our theory." Morton set the paper down. The saffron was laced with something, not poison exactly, but a substance called colchicine. It comes from autumn crocus. In small doses, it can mimic food poisoning, but in higher doses— Miss Marple nodded. "It causes respiratory failure. Quite the perfect crime if one weren't looking too closely." Whitaker paled slightly. Anton swallowed audibly. Elise shivered. Morton's voice hardened. "Which means someone tampered with the saffron itself." His gaze flicked to Anton. "You said the saffron was a new shipment." Anton nodded, his throat working. "Yes." "And who handled it first?" Anton hesitated. "Philippe did." Miss Marple's smile was knowing. "Did he, dear? Or did he merely assume he was the first to touch it?" A tense silence settled over the room. Elise suddenly spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Philippe was furious earlier, before service started. I heard him arguing with someone. I couldn't hear everything, but he kept saying, 'You had no right.'" Miss Marple's expression softened. "And do you know who he was speaking to?" Elise hesitated. Then, very slowly, she nodded. Morton's eyes darkened. Who was it, Elise? The young woman swallowed, then whispered, "It was Mr. Whittaker." All eyes turned to Whittaker, whose face had gone rigid. Miss Marple sighed. "Ah, that does explain quite a bit, doesn't it?" Morton's voice was sharp. "Explain what, exactly?" Miss Marple smoothed her cardigan. Mr. Whittaker knew Philippe was leaving, but it wasn't just the loss of his head chef that troubled him. No, it was something else. Something Philippe must have discovered. Something that made him confront Whittaker just hours before his death. Whittaker's knuckles were white against the armrest. "You're speculating." Miss Marple shook her head. "No, dear. I'm simply piecing together what you already know to be true." Morton took a step closer. "So tell me, Whittaker, what exactly did Philippe discover?" Whittaker's lips pressed into a thin line. His silence spoke louder than words. Inspector Morton's gaze was sharp, his patience wearing thin as he studied Gordon Whittaker's rigid expression. Silence in an interrogation was often louder than words, and Whittaker's refusal to defend himself only deepened the suspicion in the room. Miss Marple, however, was not yet convinced. Her gentle eyes observed the scene with quiet contemplation, her fingers tracing the embroidered edges of her handkerchief. A crime of this nature, so carefully orchestrated, so dependent on precise timing, was rarely the work of a man as impulsive as Whittaker. He had motive, yes, but he lacked something far more important: desperation. "Whittaker," Morton said, his tone pressing now. "Why did Philippe say, 'You had no right'? What was he referring to?" Whittaker exhaled sharply through his nose. His fingers tightened around the arms of his chair before he finally spoke. "It was nothing." Miss Marple gave a soft hum of disapproval. "Oh, but it was certainly something, dear. You see, I believe Philippe found out about whatever you were hiding. Perhaps a business decision you made without consulting him? Or something in the restaurant's accounts that didn't quite add up." Whittaker's lips parted slightly, his gaze flicking toward Morton, then back to Miss Marple. That flicker of hesitation confirmed it. Morton's jaw clenched. So it was financial. Whittaker sighed. Philippe was more than just a chef. He had a financial stake in the Red Pheasant. He insisted on overseeing the restaurant's books from time to time, though I always managed them myself. He hesitated. "Recently, I made some adjustments." "Adjustments?" Morton echoed. "I moved some of the restaurant's funds," Whittaker admitted, running a hand through his hair. "Nothing illegal, but not something Philippe would have approved of. He found out last week. Confronted me earlier tonight. That's what you heard, Elise." Elise swallowed, but nodded. Morton scoffed. "And you expect us to believe that's all it was? You had every reason to want him out of the way." Whittaker glared. "I wouldn't kill him over that. I may have been angry, but I'm not a murderer." Before Morton could press further, an officer entered the room, a crisp folder tucked under his arm. "Sir," he said, handing Morton the file. "Forensics report just came in." Morton opened it and skimmed the contents. His brows lifted slightly, then his mouth set in a firm line. "Well, well," he muttered. Miss Marple watched with mild curiosity as Morton turned to Anton. "It appears we found something interesting, Mr. Durand." Anton's breath hitched. "Me?" Morton nodded. "Your fingerprints were found on the container of saffron Philippe used for the bisque." Anton's face drained of color. "That, of course they were. I handle ingredients all the time." Morton closed the folder. "No one else's prints were found on that container, Anton. Not even Philippe's." A ripple of tension spread through the room. Elise gasped. "That's not possible. I saw Philippe take the saffron out himself." Anton's hands trembled slightly. I don't know how—" Morton cut him off. "The evidence speaks for itself. You had access to the kitchen, you were near the dish before it was served, And now we have proof you handled the saffron before Philippe used it. He exhaled sharply. Anton Durand, I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of Philippe Laurent. Anton shot to his feet, knocking his chair back. No, I didn't do this. Officers moved in swiftly, grabbing him by the arms. Anton struggled, his eyes wide with panic. Please, you have to believe me. I didn't poison him. Miss Marple remained seated, watching quietly as the scene unfolded. There was a sort of heaviness in her eyes, as though she were listening to a conversation no one else could hear. Anton was dragged toward the exit, his protests echoing down the hall. Morton exhaled, rubbing his temples. That's that, then. But Miss Marple did not look satisfied. Elise wiped her eyes. It was really Anton? Whitaker shook his head in disbelief. I never would have thought. Miss Marple tapped a finger lightly against her knee. How very curious. Morton turned to her. Something wrong, Miss Marple? Her expression was thoughtful. Oh, I wouldn't say wrong, dear. Merely incomplete. Morton scoffed. We have motive, opportunity, and physical evidence. What more do you need? Miss Marple smiled gently. Ah, but that is precisely what troubles me. It is all so very neat. Whitaker frowned. Isn't that a good thing? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Not necessarily. You see, true crimes are often rather untidy. They have frayed edges, loose ends that do not quite fit. But this has been wrapped up so perfectly that one might almost suspect it was designed to be discovered. Morton folded his arms. Are you saying Anton was framed? Miss Marple's expression did not change, but her voice was kind. Oh, I rather think the real criminal is still among us. A heavy silence fell over the room. Elise's breath hitched. Whitaker stiffened. Morton's eyes darted between them. Miss Marple sighed softly. And if I am correct, I fear they are not quite finished. Miss Marple's quiet assertion settled over the room like a thin layer of frost. No one spoke, but the shift in energy was palpable. Uncertainty creeping into the air, suspicion reawakening in the minds of those who thought the ordeal was over. Inspector Morton, who prided himself on efficiency, narrowed his eyes at her, yet there was no outright dismissal. Still among us, he echoed, his voice low. You're not convinced Anton did it? Miss Marple dabbed at the corner of her mouth with her handkerchief, a small habit of hers when deep in thought. Oh, Inspector, I do believe young Anton has been most unfortunate. The evidence against him is clear, yes, but clarity is not the same as truth. No, I fear this crime is older than it appears. Whitaker frowned. Older? Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the window, where the dim glow of the streetlights outside barely reached the corners of the restaurant. Crimes do not always begin on the day they are committed, Mr. Whitaker. They often have roots, deep ones, tangled in past grievances, forgotten betrayals, debts left unpaid. She glanced back at Morton. Tell me, Inspector, has there ever been another incident linked to the red pheasant? An old crime, perhaps overlooked, or one that never quite found its conclusion? Morton stiffened slightly, as if resisting an instinct to dismiss her question outright. He was a man who dealt in tangible facts, in fingerprints and witness statements, not in whispers of the past, but Miss Marple had a way of unsettling the rigid boundaries of an investigation. He sighed, rubbing his chin. There was something, he admitted after a pause. Years ago, the previous owner, before Whitaker took over, was a man named Francis Bellamy. He ran the place well enough, but there was an incident. A young chef, Pierre Marchand, disappeared one night without a trace. Left his station mid-shift, never came back. Elise's breath caught in her throat. I remember that, she murmured. I was only starting here then. It was strange. No one ever found out what happened to him. Miss Marple's expression did not change, but her grip on her handkerchief tightened slightly. How curious. Morton exhaled. Look, I doubt it's relevant. That was over a decade ago. We had no evidence of foul play, no indication that... But there was an investigation, yes? Miss Marple asked gently. A brief one, Morton admitted. Nothing came of it. The prevailing theory was that Pierre left voluntarily, ran off for some reason. Miss Marple's eyes flickered toward Whitaker. Mr. Whitaker, when did you purchase the red pheasant? He hesitated. About 7 years ago. And before that? Whitaker shifted uncomfortably. I worked in Paris, various restaurants. Miss Marple studied him for a long moment before speaking again, her voice even softer. And Philippe, he was not the head chef when you arrived, was he? No. Whitaker's voice was tight. I hired him later. Miss Marple nodded, as though something had finally clicked into place. Then she turned to Elise. Dear, you said that Pierre Marchand's disappearance was strange. Tell me, what do you recall about his last night here? Elise bit her lip, her brow furrowed in thought. It was busy, as usual. But I remember Pierre seemed anxious all evening, like he was distracted. He kept looking over his shoulder, as if he expected someone to be watching him. Miss Marple tilted her head. And did he say anything peculiar? Elise hesitated. He did, actually. I remember now, just before he vanished, he told me he'd seen something he wasn't meant to see. I thought he was just being dramatic, but then... Her voice faltered. Then he was gone. A silence fell over the room. Miss Marple's voice was almost a whisper. He saw something. Morton exhaled. This is getting us nowhere. Pierre's disappearance was years ago. There's nothing to connect it to Philippe's murder. Isn't there? Miss Marple murmured. 2 chefs, both tied to this restaurant. One vanishes without a trace, and the other is murdered in a manner designed to mislead us. Does that not suggest a pattern, Inspector? Morton frowned, but said nothing. Miss Marple continued, her voice carrying an unsettling certainty. Pierre Marchand did not run away. He was silenced, and now, years later, Philippe Laurent has met the same fate. The question is, what secret did they share? Whitaker shifted again, his fingers twitching against the tabletop. Miss Marple turned her gaze to him. Mr. Whitaker, when you arrived at the Red Pheasant, you made many changes, did you not? I modernized the kitchen, Whitaker said carefully. Updated the menu, refined the clientele. But you also brought in your own staff. Yes, that's standard practice. Miss Marple nodded. I'm sure it is. But tell me, why Philippe? Of all the chefs in France, why him? Whitaker's jaw tightened. Elise's eyes widened. They knew each other. Miss Marple smiled gently. Yes, dear, they did. Her gaze sharpened as she looked at Whitaker, and I believe Philippe was there the night Pierre Marchand disappeared. Whitaker swallowed, but his expression remained composed. Morton straightened. Are you saying Whitaker had something to do with Marchand's disappearance? Miss Marple sighed. I do not yet know the full truth, but I believe Philippe did, and that knowledge cost him his life. Whitaker's voice was steady, but there was something almost rehearsed about it. This is absurd. Philippe and I worked together, yes, but... Miss Marple interrupted, her tone still polite but firm. You misunderstand me, Mr. Whitaker. I do not think you killed Philippe. Whitaker blinked. Elise gasped. Then who... Miss Marple looked past Whitaker, her gaze settling on someone who had been quiet all this time. A shadow flickered across the face of the person in question, a hesitation so brief it might have been missed by anyone who wasn't watching closely. Miss Marple smiled. Kindly, almost apologetically. It was you, wasn't it? And in that moment, the true murderer knew. They had been seen. Miss Marple's words hung in the air, delicate yet sharp as a needle slipping through fabric. All eyes turned toward the person in question, the one who had sat still, quiet and composed throughout the entire ordeal. Elise. Her breath caught, but she quickly recovered, forcing a bewildered smile. Me? She stammered. But that's ridiculous. Why would I have anything to do with—" Miss Marple's expression remained gentle. "Oh, my dear, I don't believe you meant to kill anyone, but I do believe you know far more than you've let on." Elise shook her head vigorously. "No, I've told you everything I know." Inspector Morton folded his arms. "Then why do you look so nervous?" Because this is terrifying," Elise exclaimed. "You're all staring at me as if I've done something wrong. I work here. I loved Philippe. Why would I—" Miss Marple tilted her head. "Yes, why would you? Unless, of course, you weren't supposed to be here that night. Unless someone expected you to be elsewhere. But you saw something, didn't you?" Elise hesitated, her lips parting as if to deny it. Then she snapped her mouth shut. Miss Marple's voice softened. "It must be very difficult, carrying the weight of something you cannot say, knowing that the truth could place you in danger." Elise swallowed hard, her fingers twisting together in her lap. Miss Marple turned to Morton. "Inspector, may I trouble you for a small demonstration? A simple experiment, if you will." Morton sighed but nodded. "Go on." Miss Marple reached into her handbag and pulled out a small silver spoon. The polished surface gleamed under the dim lights. "A spoon?" Whitaker scoffed. Miss Marple smiled. "A mirror of sorts. Quite a useful thing." She turned back to Elise. "Would you humor me, my dear? Take this spoon and hold it as if you were checking your reflection." Elise blinked in confusion, but with the room watching, she hesitantly obeyed, grasping the spoon by its handle and tilting it slightly toward herself. Miss Marple observed her carefully. "Now, dear, tell me, when Pierre Marchand disappeared all those years ago, did you notice anything odd about that night? Anything at all?" Elise frowned. I already told you. He was nervous." Miss Marple nodded. "And Philippe? Did he seem different that evening?" Elise opened her mouth, then closed it. Miss Marple watched closely. "What is it, dear?" I don't know," Elise whispered. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with something almost mischievous. "You do know, my dear. You just haven't let yourself remember." Elise's grip on the spoon tightened. Miss Marple's voice was soothing. "Memories have a way of slipping into the corners of our minds, hidden from view until we see them from just the right angle. Rather like how a reflection can show us things our eyes might not catch directly." Elise looked down at the spoon. The polished surface distorted her reflection, curving the image ever so slightly, stretching it in unnatural ways. She inhaled sharply. Miss Marple nodded encouragingly. "You've remembered something, haven't you?" Elise's hands trembled. It's stupid. It's nothing." Morton stepped closer. "Go on," he said, more gently than usual. Elise swallowed, eyes flickering between them before finally landing on Miss Marple. "It's just, the night Pierre vanished, Philippe wasn't in the kitchen. Not the whole time. I never thought much of it before, but now—" She trailed off, her voice barely a whisper. Miss Marple's tone was gentle. "Where was he?" Elise's fingers twitched. "He stepped outside, through the back door, just for a few minutes." Whitaker stiffened. Miss Marple did not miss it. Elise clenched the spoon. I remember now because I saw something strange in the reflection of the kitchen window. A second shadow moving behind him. Someone was already out there." A heavy silence followed. Miss Marple exhaled softly. "And yet, when he returned, he acted as though nothing had happened." Elise nodded. "I thought he'd just gone to get some air. But maybe—" She bit her lip. "Maybe Pierre never left on his own." Morton straightened, his entire demeanor shifting. "Damn it," he muttered. Miss Marple turned to him. You see, Inspector, we were so focused on Philippe as the victim that we did not consider him as a link between two crimes. He was not just a bystander when Pierre disappeared. He was involved. Whitaker suddenly stood, his chair scraping against the floor. This is absurd. Miss Marple regarded him with polite curiosity. You seem rather unsettled, Mr. Whitaker. Whitaker's jaw tightened. Because this is nonsense. You're spinning wild theories from a girl's half-remembered reflection in a spoon. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Perhaps, or perhaps we are finally seeing things as they truly are. Whitaker glared at her, but there was something else in his expression now. Something wary. Morton stepped in. Whitaker, you knew Philippe before you hired him, didn't you? Whitaker hesitated. Yes, I told you that already. Miss Marple's voice was calm. Did you know him before Pierre disappeared? A muscle twitched in Whitaker's jaw. Morton narrowed his eyes. Answer the question. Whitaker's lips parted, then pressed into a thin line. Miss Marple sighed. I do believe we are finally circling the truth. We have been looking at this the wrong way round. Philippe was not the final victim in this story. He was the loose thread, the one who knew too much. Whitaker's hands curled into fists. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle, but there was steel beneath it. You weren't just a new owner, Mr. Whitaker. You came back to the Red Pheasant to tie up unfinished business, didn't you? Whitaker's breath hitched, so slight, so quick, but Miss Marple caught it. Morton stepped forward. You're coming with me. Whitaker bolted. It happened fast, too fast for anyone to react at first. The door slammed open and he darted into the hallway. Morton swore and sprinted after him. Miss Marple simply watched. She had known, of course. The truth had been hiding in the shadows all along, waiting to be seen. Miss Marple remained seated as the thunder of footsteps echoed down the corridor. Whitaker's desperate escape was not unexpected. Men like him, when cornered, always tried to flee. It was their instinct, bred from years of deception, from knowing that the truth could unravel everything they had built. She folded her hands in her lap, waiting. The world had a way of correcting itself, given time. A crash sounded in the distance, followed by a sharp yell and a string of curses. Morton had caught up to him. Elise let out a shaky breath, her fingers still gripping the spoon as if it held the last thread of her composure. The others stood frozen, watching the doorway, but Miss Marple's gaze drifted instead to the table near the fireplace, where a single folder lay unattended. It was Whitaker's folder, the one he had been holding before everything unraveled. It contained the final pieces of the puzzle. Records, documents, the last proof tying him to Philippe and Pierre Marchand's disappearance. He had not taken it with him in his panic. Miss Marple rose from her chair and made her way toward it, lifting the folder carefully. A collection of papers, some yellowed with age, others freshly printed, slid beneath her fingers. She had just begun leafing through. Then, when she heard a faint sound behind her, a breath, a movement too small for most to notice. Then, before she could react, a hand snatched the folder from her grasp. She turned sharply, just in time to see another figure slip through the doorway. The shock was momentary, but the recognition was immediate. Elise. The girl was already moving, clutching the folder to her chest as she ran. "Stop her!" Miss Marple called, but the command came too late. Elise was young, quick on her feet, and the momentary hesitation of those in the room gave her the advantage. Damn it! Whitaker's head had barely reappeared in the doorway, flanked by a breathless Inspector Morton, when Elise vanished down the back corridor. What the devil? Morton wheeled around, barking orders. Constables scrambled to follow, but Miss Marple knew, even before the chase began, that Elise had planned this. She had chosen her moment carefully, waited for the precise second when all eyes were elsewhere. And now, the most crucial piece of evidence had slipped through their fingers. Whitaker, still panting from his failed escape, let out a low, bitter laugh. "Clever girl," he muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. "Didn't think she had it in her." Miss Marple turned to him, eyes sharp. "No, you wouldn't, would you? Men like you rarely notice the ones who see everything." Whitaker's smirk faded. Morton clenched his fists. "Where the hell is she going?" Miss Marple considered for a moment. "She's not running away. She's making sure no one ever sees what's in that folder." Morton's face darkened. "Then we'd better get to her first." The chase led them through the winding halls of the Red Pheasant, past the warm glow of dining rooms and the startled faces of patrons. The old inn was a maze, full of hidden doors and forgotten corridors. Elise had an advantage. She knew the building well. Miss Marple, moving with surprising swiftness for her age, followed the commotion until they reached the rear of the building. The door leading to the service yard stood ajar, swinging slightly in the wind. Outside, the night was thick with mist, the damp air heavy with the scent of rain. Morton pushed through first, scanning the yard. "She can't have gone far." Miss Marple exhaled, her breath steady despite the tension. "She won't leave the grounds, not until she's done what she set out to do." A flash of movement. Near the stone wall at the edge of the property, just beyond the faint glow of the lanterns, Elise knelt beside a pile of kindling. She was frantic, her hands shaking as she fumbled with a box of matches. Miss Marple's voice was calm but firm. "Elise!" The girl flinched but did not turn. The match flared in her fingers, illuminating her pale face. "Elise, please," Miss Marple continued, taking slow steps forward. "Burning the truth won't make it disappear." Elise hesitated, the match trembling above the papers. Morton stepped forward, his voice gruff but not unkind. "It's over, Elise. Put it down." Elise inhaled sharply. "You don't understand." Her voice was raw, thick with something between panic and grief. "If you read this, it won't just be about Whitaker. It won't end with him." Miss Marple's expression remained gentle. "Who are you protecting, dear?" Elise squeezed her eyes shut. "It's not about protecting, it's about surviving." Miss Marple took another step closer. "Whatever you know, we can help you, but if you destroy that folder, we may never know the full truth." Elise's breath was ragged. The match burned low, the flame dangerously close to her fingertips, and then, just as quickly as it had sparked to life, she let it fall. The tiny ember hissed as it met the damp ground, fizzling out into the night. Her shoulders shook. She did not resist when Morton gently took the folder from her grasp. Miss Marple exhaled, stepping back as the tension in the air slowly unwound. The danger had passed, but the deeper mystery had yet to be unraveled. Morton opened the folder, his eyes scanning the documents inside. His expression darkened. "God help us," he muttered. Miss Marple peered over his shoulder, her sharp gaze taking in the papers. What she saw confirmed what she had suspected. Whitaker was only a part of the story. The real truth was far more dangerous than any of them had realized. A gust of wind ruffled the papers as Morton flipped through the folder, his expression growing more grim with every page. Miss Marple observed in silence, noting the way his fingers tightened slightly at the edges, the subtle furrow of his brow. She had seen that look before, disbelief mingled with dawning horror. Whatever secrets the folder held, they were not merely damning, they were dangerous. Whitaker, still restrained by a pair of constables, smirked despite the bruises forming along his jaw. "Well," he murmured, voice hoarse from exertion, "you've got your prize. Now what?" Miss Marple's gaze flickered to Elise, who stood frozen, her breath still uneven. The girl was unraveling before their eyes, caught between relief and terror. Before anyone could answer, a sound cut through the night, a sharp, metallic clang from within the inn. The unmistakable echo of a door slamming shut. Every head turned. One of the constables straightened. "That came from the kitchens." Miss Marple's stomach tightened. The kitchens, where Philippe Marchand had drawn his last breath, where the first crime had set all of this into motion. Morton snapped the folder shut. "Stay with them," he ordered the other officers, before moving swiftly toward the building. Miss Marple followed without hesitation, her steps measured but urgent. They crossed the damp courtyard and re-entered through the service entrance. The once bustling kitchen was now eerily quiet, the warm scent of simmering broth lingering in the air. Copper pots hung in neat rows, their polished surfaces reflecting the dim glow of a single overhead light. Then, just as Morton reached for the nearest door handle, the silence was shattered. A piercing scream. Miss Marple stiffened, the sound slicing through her like a blade. It was coming from deeper inside the inn. Morton swore under his breath and broke into a run. Miss Marple kept pace as best she could, following the detective through the dimly lit corridors. The scream had already faded into a muffled cry, but its source was unmistakable. The wine cellar. Morton reached the heavy wooden door first and shoved it open. The scent of damp stone and aged oak barrels filled the air. At the center of the room, a figure lay sprawled across the floor, limbs awkwardly splayed. Elise. Miss Marple's breath caught as she hurried forward. Elise's face was pale, her eyes wide but unfocused. A trickle of blood ran from her temple, disappearing into her dark curls. Morton crouched beside her, fingers quickly checking for a pulse. "She's alive," he said, but his relief was short-lived. His gaze swept the room, his body tensing. "Someone else was here." Miss Marple followed his line of sight. A second door at the far end of the cellar, one that led to the alley, hung slightly ajar. Morton cursed and bolted toward it. He flung it open just in time to glimpse a shadowy figure disappearing into the mist. The dim lantern light caught the briefest flash of fabric, dark, nondescript, vanishing into the night. By the time Morton reached the alley, the figure was gone. Miss Marple knelt beside Elise, studying the girl's features. Her breathing was shallow but steady, and her fingers twitched slightly as if clinging to consciousness. Carefully, Miss Marple reached for her hand. "Elise, dear," she said softly. "Can you hear me?" The girl's eyelids fluttered. A weak gasp escaped her lips. Morton reappeared in the doorway, frustration evident in every rigid movement. Gone. Whoever it was, they knew the alley well. Miss Marple did not look up. Her focus remained on Elise, watching as her fingers twitched again. Then, just as Miss Marple was about to speak, Elise's lips parted. A single word escaped, a whisper so faint it was nearly lost to the shadows. "Poison." Miss Marple's heart jolted. "Elise?" she urged gently. "What do you mean?" The girl swallowed, her throat working painfully. She forced her eyes open, the fear in them raw and unguarded. "They tried." Her voice cracked. "They tried to—" A fresh wave of pain overtook her, and she squeezed her eyes shut, unable to finish. Miss Marple pressed a reassuring hand over Elise's own before looking up at Morton. "She was attacked," she said, her voice steady. "And she was meant to die." Morton's jaw clenched. "Because of the folder?" Perhaps. Miss Marple's gaze darkened. Or perhaps because she knew something. Something even she did not yet realize. Morton ran a hand over his face, his frustration palpable. "Damn it! We had Whitaker in custody. We thought the danger was over." Miss Marple shook her head. "No, my dear. The danger was never Whitaker alone. The real villain is still ahead of us." Morton exhaled sharply, his mind already working through possibilities. "We need to find out what Elise saw, and we need to do it before whoever tried to silence her gets another chance." Miss Marple nodded. The case had taken a sharp turn, and now, more than ever, time was against them. The villain was still playing their game, and they were running out of moves. Miss Marple sat beside Elise's bed in the small upstairs room, watching as the girl's breathing evened out. A nurse, fetched hastily from the nearby village, had cleaned the wound on her temple and given her something to ease the pain. Though Elise had drifted into an exhausted sleep, her earlier words still echoed in Miss Marple's mind. Poison. It was not a random attack. Someone had tried to silence her, and they had nearly succeeded. Morton stood by the window, his arms crossed as he stared out into the mist-covered courtyard below. His frustration had only grown, but there was something else in his expression now. Something colder, more calculating. "Someone inside this inn still believes they can get away with it," he muttered. "Whoever attacked Elise is desperate." Miss Marple nodded absently, her fingers tracing the floral embroidery on the armrest of her chair. Her mind, however, was elsewhere, piecing together threads, finding their intersections. Something had been bothering her since the moment she first arrived at the inn, a sense that the pieces did not quite fit. She thought back to Philippe Marchand, slumped over the kitchen counter, his lifeless hand curled around the base of the copper pot. She thought of the missing recipe book, the altered kitchen ledger, and Whitaker's insistence that he had been framed. There had been deception at every turn, and yet the true culprit had remained hidden in the background, manipulating events unseen. Her gaze drifted to the bedside table. The nurse had left a glass of water there, its surface still rippling from the disturbance of being placed down. Miss Marple's thoughts snagged on the movement, and suddenly something shifted in her mind. Something she had overlooked. A misplaced object. Her breath caught. It had been so small, so seemingly unimportant, that she had dismissed it at first, but now it made perfect sense. She turned sharply to Morton. "Tell me, my dear, do you recall the glass that was found next to Philippe Marchand's body?" Morton frowned, caught off guard. "The one with the wine?" "Of course." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but urgent. "And you remember the initial assumption, that he drank from it before collapsing?" Morton's brow furrowed. "Yes, but we later determined the poison was in the food, not the wine." Miss Marple gave a small, satisfied nod. "Exactly. And yet the glass was there, as if it was meant to tell a story that never quite matched reality." Morton stared at her for a long moment, then exhaled sharply. "You think it was staged?" "I do." Miss Marple's fingers tightened around the armrest. "It was a detail planted for us to see, to nudge the investigation in a certain direction. But something was off about it. Do you recall the wine itself?" Morton hesitated, thinking. It was a dark red, a local vintage. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "And yet, when I examined the scene, I noticed something peculiar. The rim of the glass was completely clean." Morton blinked. "Clean? Not a single trace of wine on the outer edge. No smudges, no signs of it having touched his lips." A sharp silence filled the room as Morton processed the revelation. "The glass was placed there," Miss Marple continued. "It was meant to suggest that he had been drinking, but in reality, he never touched it. And if that detail was staged, then we must ask ourselves, why?" Morton swore under his breath, his mind working quickly now. "If someone went to the trouble of placing the glass there, they were trying to mislead us." Miss Marple's lips pressed together, "which means we need to look again at everything we assumed to be true." A rustling sound from the bed made them both turn. Elise's eyes had fluttered open, her gaze slightly unfocused but searching. Her voice cracked. She swallowed hard before forcing out the words. "The spice rack." Miss Marple leaned closer. "What about it, dear?" Elise's brow creased. "The day before he died, Chef Marchand was reorganizing the spices. He was muttering to himself about how something was all wrong." She swallowed again, her expression tightening. "He was angry, not just the way he got about recipes, really angry." Miss Marple felt her heartbeat quicken. "Did he say why?" Elise's eyelids drooped again, exhaustion tugging at her. "No," she murmured. "But I remember, he took out a tin. And then—" Her voice faded into sleep, the effort too much for her weakened state. Morton exhaled. "A spice tin." Miss Marple was already rising from her chair. "I believe we must pay another visit to the kitchen." The two of them moved quickly, descending the creaking staircase to the now quiet heart of the inn. The kitchen felt almost eerie in its stillness, so different from the bustling warmth it had held before tragedy struck. Morton wasted no time, stepping toward the spice rack near the long wooden counter. Row upon row of labeled tins lined the shelf, arranged meticulously. But Miss Marple was not interested in the ones neatly in place. Her hands moved instinctively, reaching for the second row where dust settled just slightly thicker than in the front. She ran her fingers along the edge of the tins until she stopped. A single tin sat slightly askew. The label read sumac, but when she lifted it, it was heavier than it should have been. Her eyes met Morton's. Slowly, carefully, she unscrewed the lid. Inside was not sumac. It was a fine, white powder. Morton took the tin, his jaw set in a grim line. "This isn't a spice." Miss Marple studied it thoughtfully. "No, my dear. It is something far more sinister." The pattern was emerging now, clear as day. The poisoning had been precise, deliberate, designed to appear as a mere culinary mishap. But the detail that had unraveled it all was so simple. A glass of wine that had never been sipped. The killer had been in plain sight from the beginning, and now they were running out of places to hide. Miss Marple turned the tin slowly in her hands, her sharp gaze narrowing as she examined the fine white powder inside. A mislabeled spice tin, hidden in plain sight, holding a substance that was never meant to season a dish but to end a life. This was no mere accident, no impulsive crime. It was deliberate, methodical, planned down to the smallest detail, and yet there was still something missing. The why of it all. Morton stepped closer, taking the tin from her and shaking his head. "So we have the murder weapon," he murmured. "But that still doesn't explain who put it here, or why." Miss Marple set the lid back on the tin, placing it gently on the counter as she gathered her thoughts. Philippe Marchand had been an exacting chef, obsessed with precision. Every detail in his kitchen was accounted for, yet he had noticed something was all wrong the day before he died. It had angered him, not the way a simple kitchen mishap would. This was something deeper, something personal. She thought back to the people at the inn. Whitaker, with his nervous insistence on his innocence. Elise, attacked before she could reveal something important. Marie, who had spoken of old secrets with such hesitation. There was more to this than a dispute over recipes. She turned to Morton, her voice calm but firm. "I believe we must have another word with Marie Laurent." Marie was in the small lounge near the dining room, seated by the fireplace, staring into the flames. She looked up as they approached, her expression wary. "Inspector, Miss Marple," she greeted, her voice carefully neutral. Miss Marple took a seat across from her, folding her hands in her lap. "Marie, I must ask you something rather delicate," she said gently. "It concerns Philippe Marchand and what he discovered before his death." Marie's fingers tightened around the arm of the chair. "I told you," she said softly. "Philippe was an old friend. But if you're asking me to explain his actions before he died, I can't. He kept things to himself." Miss Marple studied her carefully. "But you knew, didn't you, that something was troubling him?" Marie looked away, her lips pressing together. "Yes," she admitted after a long pause. "I knew. He was preoccupied, more so than usual. But he wouldn't tell me why." Miss Marple glanced at Morton before speaking again. "Marie, did Philippe ever speak to you about the spice rack?" Marie's eyes flickered with something unreadable. She hesitated. What do you mean? He noticed something was all wrong with it the day before his death, Miss Marple said, and we have just found a tin that was deliberately mislabeled, one that contained poison, not a spice. Marie inhaled sharply, but she said nothing. Miss Marple continued. Someone put it there, Marie. Someone who knew exactly how he worked, how precise he was, someone who knew he would notice. She let the words hang in the air before delivering the final blow. And someone who knew he would not stay silent. Marie's hands trembled slightly, and for a moment Miss Marple thought she might deny it. But then, with a deep, shuddering breath, Marie slumped back in her chair. I tried to warn him, she whispered. Morton straightened. Warn him? Marie looked up, her eyes shining with emotion. Philippe, he was going to tell the truth, she said. He was tired of it. He didn't care about the consequences anymore. Miss Marple's voice was gentle but insistent. The truth about what, Marie? Marie hesitated. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, The past. Miss Marple's breath caught. Marie swallowed hard. You think this is about a recipe, about a rivalry in the kitchen, but it's not. It's about something that happened years ago, something Philippe couldn't forget. Morton leaned in. What happened, Marie? Marie's gaze flickered to Miss Marple, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of a long-buried secret. 15 years ago, there was a fire, a terrible fire, in a small restaurant in Lyon. It was never proven, but Philippe always suspected it wasn't an accident. He believed someone set it deliberately, to hide something. And now I think he was right. Miss Marple's mind whirred. A fire, a cover-up, a crime buried in the past, only to resurface now in the most unexpected of ways. Who owned the restaurant? She asked. Marie hesitated. Then, her voice barely above her breath, she said, Henri Dupont. Morton's face darkened. Dupont, he muttered. Of course. Miss Marple's mind worked quickly, pieces falling into place. Henri Dupont, one of the most respected chefs in France, a man whose career had flourished in the years after the fire, a man who had built an empire on his culinary genius. But was it truly his genius? Philippe knew something, didn't he? Miss Marple said softly. Something about that fire. Marie nodded. He always suspected that the fire wasn't just an accident. He believed someone used it as an opportunity to steal, to take something valuable and make it their own. Miss Marple's pulse quickened. A recipe, Marie exhaled sharply. No, not just any recipe. She looked up, her eyes burning with intensity. The recipe, the one that made Dupont famous, the one that brought him everything. Morton's jaw clenched. You're saying Dupont stole his signature recipe from Philippe? Marie nodded. Philippe worked for him, you see. Years ago, before Dupont was a household name. They were both young, ambitious, but Philippe was the true innovator. He created the dish that made Dupont a legend. And then the fire happened. And everything Philippe had created was gone, destroyed, or so he thought. Miss Marple's voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. Until he realized Dupont had taken it for himself. Marie's hands tightened in her lap. Yes, she swallowed. Philippe spent years trying to prove it. He searched for anything, any evidence that could expose Dupont. And finally he found it. Miss Marple leaned forward. What did he find? Marie shook her head. I don't know. He wouldn't tell me. But he was certain. He said he had what he needed to bring Dupont down. Her voice broke. And now he's dead. Morton exhaled. Dupont had a motive. A strong one. Miss Marple nodded. And a reputation to protect. She sat back, deep in thought. The crime had never been about a simple rivalry, nor even about poisoning. It had been about something deeper, pride, ambition, betrayal. and now it was time to confront the past head-on. Miss Marple sat quietly in the lounge, her knitting needles moving with practiced ease, though her mind was anything but calm. The fire crackled gently in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room, but the warmth did nothing to soften the cold certainty that had settled within her. It was time. She had no doubt now. Henri Dupont had orchestrated the murder of Philippe Marchand. The poison, the staged evidence, the brutal attack on Elise, it had all been part of a desperate attempt to bury the past once and for all. But he had made a mistake, one that had unraveled everything. He had underestimated Miss Marple. She glanced at the clock on the mantel. Soon, the players would be in place. Whitaker was bringing Dupont down from his room under the pretense of a final discussion. Marie and Elise, though shaken, had agreed to be present. Morton stood near the doorway, tense but ready. The trap was set. A few moments later, the door opened and Henri Dupont entered, his expression carefully composed, though his eyes flickered with wariness. He was a man accustomed to power, to control, but not to being summoned. Miss Marple greeted him with a pleasant smile. "Ah, Monsieur Dupont, please do sit down." Dupont hesitated for only a moment before lowering himself into the chair opposite her. "I was told there was a matter requiring my attention." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked together before she carefully set them aside. "Yes, I wanted to speak with you about Philippe Marchand." Dupont exhaled sharply, feigning impatience. "Again, I've already answered every question." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "But you see, monsieur, there is something we have not yet discussed. Something rather important." She leaned forward, her voice soft but firm. "The fire in Lyon." For the first time, Dupont's expression flickered. Morton stepped closer. "We know, Dupont. We know Marchand suspected you of setting that fire. We know he believed you stole the recipe that made you famous. And we know he finally found proof." Dupont's fingers curled tightly around the armrest of his chair. "This is absurd." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Oh, I don't think so." She folded her hands in her lap. "You see, the truth has a rather inconvenient habit of revealing itself, no matter how deeply one tries to bury it. Philippe Marchand spent years searching for evidence, and when he found it, he knew exactly what it meant." Dupont scoffed. "And where is this supposed evidence?" Miss Marple sighed. That, I must admit, was quite the puzzle. Philippe was meticulous, but he was also cautious. He wouldn't have left it where anyone could simply take it. And then I realized. She glanced toward Marie, then Elise. He didn't. Marie's eyes widened slightly, and Elise shifted in her seat. Miss Marple's smile returned. "The answer, Monsieur Dupont, was right in front of us all along." She reached into the small bag beside her chair and pulled out a single, aged notebook. Dupont inhaled sharply. "This was found hidden in the spice rack," she continued. "The very same spice rack where you, or someone acting on your behalf, planted the poisoned tin." Dupont's jaw tightened. Miss Marple opened the notebook carefully. Inside, Philippe documented everything: the night of the fire, his suspicions, the missing pages from his original recipe book. And here, on the final entry, she turned the book toward Morton. "His final words before his death." Morton took the notebook, skimming the page before looking back at Dupont. "It's over." Dupont's expression darkened, his usual air of authority slipping. For the first time, he looked truly trapped. Then, suddenly, his hand shot toward the heavy brass candle holder on the side table. But Morton was faster. He seized Dupont's wrist in a vice-like grip and twisted his arm back, forcing him to drop the makeshift weapon. It clattered to the floor. Dupont let out a sharp breath, his chest rising and falling as he glared at them. "You have nothing?" Miss Marple shook her head. "Oh, but we do. Poisoned spice tins, a staged crime scene, a silenced witness." Her voice softened, almost pitying. And now, your own desperation. Dupont's shoulders sagged, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then, finally, with a bitter chuckle, he leaned back in the chair. "Well," he murmured, "it appears you've won." Morton signaled for Whitaker, who stepped forward. "Henri Dupont, you're under arrest for the murder of Philippe Marchand." Dupont's lips curled into something that might have been a smirk, had it not been so empty. He should have left the past where it belonged. Miss Marple regarded him steadily. "The past never stays buried, Monsieur Dupont. Not when justice is waiting to be served." Miss Marple observed Dupont as he sat in quiet resignation, his fingers idly tapping against the armrest of his chair. There was something unsatisfying about his surrender. He had fought so hard, taken such desperate measures to conceal his crime, and yet, at the moment of his downfall, there was no rage, no outburst, just acceptance. It troubled her. Whitaker tightened the cuffs around Dupont's wrists, his expression firm. "You'll have your day in court," he said, "and considering the evidence, I'd wager it won't go well for you." Dupont exhaled a slow breath, his lips twitching in something resembling amusement. "Ah," he murmured. "Evidence. Such a tricky thing, no?" Miss Marple narrowed her eyes. "Meaning?" Dupont leaned forward slightly. "You are quite thorough, madame, but tell me, why would I be so foolish as to leave that notebook hidden in the spice rack? Why not destroy it the moment I found it?" Morton, who had been scanning the pages again, frowned. "Because you didn't have time. Marchand must have hidden it before you could act." Dupont's smirk deepened. "That is one explanation." A chill crept up Miss Marple's spine. There was something in his tone, something just beneath the surface of his words that suggested they had overlooked something vital. She turned back to the notebook, her fingers ghosting over the brittle pages. The ink was smudged in places, the handwriting growing shaky toward the end. Then she saw it. The final entry. Marchand had written frantically, his words uneven, but one line stood out. "Il sait. Il viendra me chercher avant que je puisse parler." He knows. He will come for me before I can speak. Miss Marple's breath hitched. Not they. He. Her mind worked swiftly, piecing together fragments of conversation, small gestures, lingering glances exchanged between Dupont and... She looked up sharply, her eyes locking onto Morton. For a fraction of a second, something flickered in his expression. Surprise, perhaps. Annoyance. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. Miss Marple's voice was deceptively gentle. "Monsieur Morton, I wonder, where exactly did you find this notebook?" Morton hesitated, his grip tightening ever so slightly on the book. "It was in the spice rack, just as you said." Miss Marple offered him a pleasant smile. "Ah, yes. But how did you know to look there?" The room fell silent. Morton's jaw tensed. "We were searching the kitchen, looking for the poisoned tin. It made sense to check every shelf." Miss Marple nodded. "Of course. But tell me, when exactly did you find it?" Whitaker frowned. "What are you getting at, Miss Marple?" She kept her gaze fixed on Morton. "I believe Monsieur Dupont is telling us something quite important. He is correct. Why would he leave such damning evidence where it could be so easily found?" Dupont chuckled. "Indeed, that is the question, is it not?" Miss Marple turned the notebook toward the firelight, scrutinizing the ink. "This final entry. The ink is still bold. It has not faded as much as the previous pages. It was written recently." Morton's fingers twitched. "And yet," Miss Marple continued, her voice now tinged with quiet certainty, "Philippe Marchand died instantly after consuming the poisoned meal. How then did he write this final entry?" Whitaker stiffened. "You mean—" Miss Marple looked back at Morton. "The answer is simple. He didn't." A heavy silence pressed upon the room. Morton let out a low, humorless laugh. "You're reaching, Miss Marple." She shook her head. "Oh, but I'm not. You planted this notebook to ensure that suspicion fell squarely on Dupont. You knew Marchand suspected him, but you also knew that suspicion alone was not enough. You needed something conclusive, something irrefutable. Marie let out a quiet gasp. Elise's hand flew to her mouth. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. "Ça, it was you, Monsieur Morton. You poisoned Marchand's meal, and then, once suspicion fell on Dupont, you ensured the evidence pointed directly to him." Morton's hand moved instinctively to the inside of his coat. Whitaker saw it and reacted instantly. He seized Morton's arm, twisting it back in one sharp movement. A knife clattered to the floor. Morton let out a harsh breath, his carefully composed demeanor now fractured. "You don't understand." His voice was low, bitter. "Marchand had to die. He was going to ruin everything." Miss Marple studied him carefully. "What did he have on you?" Morton exhaled. "Defeated? He knew about my dealings in Lyon. I was the one who helped Dupont secure that recipe all those years ago. I was the one who set the fire." His lips curled into a sneer. "And Marchand, the self-righteous fool, finally put the pieces together. He was going to expose me." Whitaker tightened his grip. "So you killed him, and when suspicion fell on Dupont, you let it." Morton gave a hollow laugh. "I didn't just let it, I orchestrated it." He turned to Dupont. "You always thought you were the clever one, Henri, but in the end, you were just as blind as the rest of them." Dupont's eyes burned with fury, but he said nothing. Whitaker forced Morton toward the door. "You're coming with me." Miss Marple watched as they led him away, her expression unreadable. The fire crackled in the hearth once, more, its warmth a stark contrast to the chill lingering in the room. Marie broke the silence. "It's over." Miss Marple gave a small smile. "Yes, my dear, I do believe it is." As the heavy oak doors of the estate creaked open, the night air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of rain-soaked earth. Whitaker led Morton out, the sound of their footsteps echoing through the grand hall. The gathered crowd watched in stunned silence, still processing the sudden turn of events. Henri Dupont, now free of suspicion, sat motionless, his hands clasped together as though still absorbing the gravity of what had transpired. Miss Marple, ever composed, adjusted her gloves and stepped forward. "It is always the smallest details that unravel the grandest schemes," she said, her voice steady yet gentle. "The ink in the notebook, the unnatural timing of Marchand's last message, and of course Monsieur Morton's reaction when I questioned him about how he found it. Lies, even well-constructed ones, have a way of revealing themselves." Marie let out a shaky breath. "I still cannot believe it. Morton he was always so polite, so helpful." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, that is precisely why he was so dangerous. A true villain rarely looks the part. It is the one who blends in, who gains trust so effortlessly that one must always be wary of." Elise clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "But how did he manage it? The poisoning, the deception. He was always with us." Whitaker returned just in time to hear the question. "Morton's been working on this for a while, hasn't he, Miss Marple?" She offered a small, knowing smile. "Indeed, Inspector, the key was in the timing. Morton had the opportunity to poison the tin long before that fateful evening. Marchand's meals were prepared in advance, stored carefully. It only took a patient hand to ensure that the right dish reached the table at the right moment. As for the notebook, he merely had to wait, observe, and fabricate the final entry when it suited him." Dupont let out a humorless chuckle. "And here I thought I was the one with enemies." Miss Marple turned to him, her expression softening. "You are not blameless, Monsieur Dupont. There were many who suffered because of your ambitions. Morton may have been the one to take Marchand's life, but there were many wounds that led to that moment." His face darkened. "So what now? I walk away, knowing I'm hated just as much as the man who killed him?" Whitaker folded his arms. "You'll have to answer for your past crimes, but for now, the law has no claim on you for Marchand's murder." DuPont exhaled, rubbing his temples. A hollow victory, then. Marie, though shaken, stepped forward. Perhaps a second chance instead. A flicker of something passed across DuPont's face. Regret, perhaps, or exhaustion. He gave a slow nod but said nothing more. Just then, a commotion stirred outside. One of the officers burst into the room, his face pale. "Inspector, Morton, he's gone!" Whitaker stiffened. "What?" "The transport was ambushed. He escaped into the woods." Gasps erupted among the guests. Elise clutched Marie's arm, her eyes wide with fear. "He's still out there!" Whitaker cursed under his breath, already heading for the door. "We need to set up a perimeter. He won't get far." Miss Marple remained eerily calm, though her sharp gaze flickered toward the darkened windows. "On the contrary, Inspector, I believe Morton has always been several steps ahead. He planned for this." Whitaker stopped. "You think he had help?" She nodded. "A man like Morton would not act without an escape plan. He has someone waiting for him." A chill settled over the room. The celebration of justice was now tainted by uncertainty. Marie whispered, "Will he come back?" Miss Marple didn't answer right away. She simply adjusted her gloves once more, staring into the night. Villains who escape rarely stay hidden forever, my dear. Their nature always brings them back into the light. Whitaker, already issuing orders to his men, turned back to her. "Then we'll be ready?" Miss Marple gave a small nod. "Yes, I do believe we will." As the cool night air wrapped around the estate, Miss Marple stood quietly by the window, gazing into the darkness where Morton had vanished. The house had begun to settle again, but the tension still lingered. Elise, Marie, and DuPont remained seated, each lost in their own thoughts. Whitaker was outside, barking orders to his men, but Miss Marple knew that catching Morton tonight would be difficult. A man like him did not run without a destination in mind. Marie, still pale from the evening's events, turned toward Miss Marple. "Do you truly believe he planned this escape all along?" Miss Marple's expression was unreadable. "He is methodical. This was not an act of desperation, but of design. The transport ambush. How fortuitous, don't you think?" Marie shivered, glancing at Elise. "Then someone helped him." "It is highly probable," Miss Marple said. "Morton was no fool. He knew that the moment his scheme unraveled, he would need an exit. Someone, somewhere, had a vested interest in his freedom." DuPont scoffed. "I suppose that makes me a suspect again." Miss Marple turned to him, her gaze sharp. "It does make one wonder who else stood to benefit from Morton's survival. If he had truly acted alone, why risk everything just to flee?" Elise swallowed. "You mean, he might still have unfinished business?" Miss Marple's silence was answer enough. Outside, the sounds of men shouting and dogs barking echoed through the night. Whitaker re-entered, his face grim. "No sign of him. He's disappeared into the woods, and with this storm rolling in, we'll lose the trail soon." Miss Marple nodded. "Then we must assume he is already far. From here. He will not wait to be found." Whitaker sighed, rubbing his temples. "I should have seen it coming. He played us." "No, Inspector," Miss Marple said gently. "He played the game he always intended to play, but games, even the cleverest ones, leave traces behind." Marie hesitated before speaking. "You mean a clue?" Miss Marple glanced toward the remnants of the evening's chaos. The upturned chair, the discarded wine glasses, the torn pages of the falsified notebook. Her fingers traced the edge of her gloves thoughtfully. A clever man does not vanish without a shadow, and Morton, well, he was far too meticulous to leave without one. Whitaker frowned. "What are you suggesting?" Miss Marple turned to him with a small, knowing smile. "That while he has escaped, the truth rarely does. We only need to listen carefully." As if on cue, a sharp gust of wind rattled the window. Somewhere beyond the estate walls, in the vast unknown of the night, Morton was still moving, still plotting. The case was closed, and yet a mystery never truly ended.